My name is Joyce Raimondo, and as you can see, I am at the Pollock-Krasner House and Study Center in East Hampton, New York. We're a national landmark located about 100 miles east of New York City. And today is a very special conversation with Helen A. Harrison, our former director for 34 years. And we're going to have a conversation with Helen. I've going to ask her different questions about her thoughts on Pollock-Krasner, her creativity, her thoughts on creativity. And at the end, we will invite the participants to ask questions as well. So before I go into the barn, it's a spectacular, almost spring day here, and I wanted to show you how beautiful the view is of Accabonac Creek. And we are the home and studio of these two great abstract expressionist artists. You can come in person soon when the house opens in May, and you can visit pkhouse.org to learn more about all of our virtual programs. So I am going to enter the barn where Pollock and Krasner made their famous abstract expressionist paintings. They're now famous abstract expressionist paintings. And then we're going to hear from Helen. Okay, so a brief bio about Helen A. Harrison. This is my opinion. Helen is a shining example of creativity. So Helen A. Harrison, the Eugene V. and Claire E. Thor director of the Pollock-Krasner House and Study Center in East Hampton from 1990 to 2024, was previously the curator of the Parish Art Museum in Southampton and Guildhall Museum in East Hampton, and a guest curator at the Queen's Museum in Flushing, New York. From 1978 to 2006, she wrote art reviews and feature articles for the New York Times, Long Island section. She was the visual arts commentator for Long Island University's NPR-affiliated radio station from 2024 to 2009. And wrote the Eye on Art column for the Sag Harbor Express from 2010 to 2020. Her articles, essays, and reviews have appeared in numerous scholarly and popular publications, and she's the author of several books, including Hampton's Bohemia, 2 Century of Artists and Writers on the Beach, monographs on Larry Rivers and Jackson Pollock, and most recently, 4 mystery novels set in the New York art world. So let's give Helen a big Zoom round of applause. Welcome. And Helen is very modest. Okay, so we're really glad that Helen is here today to share her thoughts with us. So Helen, my first question is, you've led a very creative life as an author, a critic, an artist as well, and a museum director. What do you suppose from your childhood set the stage for a creative life?
Oh my gosh, you are going back a long way. First of all, thank you very much, Joyce, for inviting me to share with everyone. And I really want to thank everybody who's been so supportive of me in my transition to retirement. I still, of course, intend to remain active in the art world, but I think that the original stimulus really came from my family. I was encouraged. I enjoyed drawing as a child, and I was sent to art lessons, and no one ever said, oh, that's a bad idea. Of course, my mother did say it would be good if you learned something practical that you could do with your art, like fashion illustration or something, or teaching something to make a living. But other than that, it was never, I was never discouraged from pursuing my artistic interests. And I did go to Adelphi University as an undergraduate and got a fine arts, studio art degree. Then I went to the Brooklyn Museum Art School, which is no longer there, very sadly. And I have to say, what a wonderful opportunity that was, because the museum, as I'm sure you all know, if you've been there, or even if you haven't, it is a comprehensive collection. And when you would be in the studio doing your work, if you got hungry and went to lunch, you got an art education just on the way to the lunchroom. And then I went to Hornsey College of Art in London for a year doing a postgrad work in sculpture. That was my medium. And then I practiced as a sculptor for a while until I went to graduate school for art history. So I have a background in studio art, which I feel was very helpful for me, both as an art historian and as a writer on art, as a journalist, because I knew what was involved in creating, actually making the art, not just analyzing it or appreciating it or looking at it, but actually physically making it. And I felt that that was an important asset to have. I knew that, you know, many of my colleagues in art history didn't really have that much firsthand contact with art. It was, we used to call it the history of slides, but it was just a very nice way of segueing from my own creative practice to writing and thinking and speaking about art, the art of others.
Now, you mentioned, Helen, your creative practice. What do you think is the basis of creative thinking? Like, what sorts of attitudes or habits would a person foster to maximize creativity?
I guess for me, keeping an open mind is the most important thing. It's funny, I think sometimes people think of Jackson Pollock as being very inarticulate, but often he was kind of on the money when it came to answering questions about things like, what is your art supposed to mean? Or how do we appreciate your art? He said, look at it passively, the way you listen to music. So if it stimulates you, if you enjoy it, if it makes you think, if it gives you something, then take whatever you can from it. But don't worry about it. Don't overanalyze it. And he said, it's like looking at a bed of flowers. You don't tear your hair out over what it means. So you bring your own meaning to it. And if you are a creative person, you're always looking for new ways, new insights, new thoughts, new approaches to how to get that expression out and communicate it to others. And as long as you're on that journey and give your energy to that quest, you will be creative.
Mhm. Now, what about if somebody comes across a creative block, which happens? Have you ever had a creative block?
Oh, sure. There are times when you just don't know where you're going to go with it. And especially with fiction writing, you know, it's a completely different thought process from writing an article or an exhibition catalog where you're basing it on, you may have opinions, but you're basing it on something concrete. When you're just making it up, sometimes you just kind of can't quite get there. And I've had the experience where I've hit a roadblock of some kind, not over a long period of time, but you know, in a specific going in a specific direction. And you just kind of have to wait for it to resolve itself. Again, like Pollock said, you don't tear your hair out. Just it will happen naturally if it's going to happen at all. But again, keep an open mind. And I'll give you an example. The very first fiction book I wrote is called An Exquisite Corpse. And it's set in New York City in 1943, and it involves the Surrealists. And there comes a moment in the book when the plot has to twist a little bit. And I couldn't quite figure out how to get it to do that and make sense. There was just this moment where I had written myself into a corner, basically. I couldn't figure it out. And I agonized over it. Finally, I said, oh, this is ridiculous. My head is hitting the pillow, literally, it came to me how to fix it, how to get it to move ahead. And it just came to me because of course I had all the background. I had, you know, everything that I had already written was contributing to it, but it was just, there was a little log jam there. And once the log jam cleared, there it was, clear as crystal. So, and I said to my husband, he said, don't you want to write it down? I said, no, I don't need to write it down. It's so obvious that now I can move ahead with it. And in the morning, I got up and I wrote it. So that does happen. But I think that it's inevitable that when you're making something out of nothing, which is what many artists do. You kind of start with an idea and then you have to crystallize it. You're going to come up against some of these roadblocks, and you just have to either wait them out or forge ahead.
Mhm. And Lee also said about her own painting, she said, I don't will the paintings, I surrender to it. So it's
Right.
a similar idea to what you're saying. Now I'm wondering, how about Pollock and Krasner? Did they ever have creative blocks? And if so, how did they get past it?
Well, I think you could only go by what I mean. I did know Lee Krasner, but very, very slightly. I didn't know her well at all. I know Ellen Landau is here. She knew her a lot better than I. But I think that for both of them, the creative stimulation of each other working in proximity, but not looking over each other's shoulders was very helpful. Lee used to say that when she was having a difficult time or if she was stuck, she would ask Jackson to come into her studio and take a look. And he would say things like, not like what you might expect, like, oh, this line is wrong, or change that color, or move this here, or change that there. He would say, it's working, stick with it, or do another one, go, leave that one aside, do another one. So it would be more kind of general but very practical advice, like stick with it. And the same thing for her going into his studio. She was very encouraging of him, and she understood what he was trying to do. Unlike many people, even many of his peers were not particularly understanding of his aims and intentions. So to have each other there as a sounding board, I think was absolutely crucial to both of them.
Mhm.
Well, I'm gonna just move a little bit so that I'm not sitting in the sunlight so much. Maybe that's better.
Mhm.
Okay.
Now, what you're mentioning, Helen, is they're giving feedback to each other, right? Which is what an art teacher does.
Well, not a critique, though. Not the way you would, like in art school, you would put your thing up and the teacher would come over and say, oh, the proportions are wrong. Oh, you have to do this. Yeah, I remember one time my sculpture teacher actually put his hands on my piece and kind of twisted it. I was working in clay, and he said, open it up, open it up. And Lee, of course, hated it when Hoffman did that to the drawings in the school. He would cut them up or tear them up and rearrange the composition. But I mean, when you're a student, you kind of have to accept that's what you're there for, is to learn. But when you're doing it on your own, or by the time Jackson and Lee moved out to Springs, they were established artists. And you're much more reliant on your own background, your own impetus to get over whatever difficulties you have. And inevitably, especially if you're working in an abstract way where you don't have preliminary drawings or sketches, you really have to let the work guide you. And Lee was very explicit about that. She said, we have a wonderful interview with her where she said, I start and make some brush strokes across the entire canvas, and then something will suggest itself to me. So it's coming from your imagination, but it's also coming from your experience. I mean, she did this 1,000 times, so it's not like she was starting from scratch every single time, but she was starting from a blank and she had to fill in that blank. And the
Mhm.
same thing for Pollock.
Mhm. So, but that being said, for someone who is an art teacher, what do you think makes a good art teacher then? How does one go about teaching art?
Oh, I mean, it's on two different levels, really. One is just the basic technical stuff, how to compose a painting, how to build a sculpture, how to physically manipulate your materials and make them do what you want them to do instead of them getting the better of you. That part can be taught and needs to be taught. I still think the drawing is a very important skill to learn, even if it's not figurative drawing or very literal drawing, but just handling drawing implements to make them do what you want them to do. But the more creative part, what you do with the implements, what you do with your materials and your techniques, that's of something as I don't think you can really teach that. unless you're teaching someone to do something very specific, like an
Mhm.
illustration, where it has to show certain things, it has to be a certain way. Otherwise, it's not acceptable to the art director, to the magazine, to whatever it is you're doing it for, to the product sponsor. It has to conform, and that's a whole different kind of practice. The practice of doing your own individual creativity that comes from another place entirely.
Mhm. Now, your bio obviously is very impressive, all the different paths your career has taken in the arts. And when you were straight out of college and then going forward, can you describe to us, how did this evolve over time? You studied the fine arts. And so how did your life career evolve? Can you describe that a little bit?
Yeah, it's a very interesting evolution, actually. When I was in art school in the 60s, I had teachers who had been on the federal art project of the WPA in the 1930s. And in my little Carnegie library in my hometown of Richmond Hill, Queens, we had a WPA mural. And when I was a kid, as an aspiring artist, my friends and I, we would go into the library and we'd argue the merits of this painting. And then when I went to art school, and there was a little plaque there, that little bronze plaque that said WPA. And when I went to art school, as I said, my teachers, some of them had been on the WPA, and they kind of encouraged me to be interested in the alternative to the commercial art world, or the gallery system. That they said, you have no idea. We got paid, we got a paycheck to do our paintings, to do our sculptures, to make our prints. And it's not going to be anything like that for you. You're going to have a gallery. You're going to have critics write about it. You're going to have collectors buy it. We didn't have to have that. So I found that really intriguing. And then after I married and moved to England, my husband, Roy Nicholson, whom I met at the Brooklyn Museum Art School, was working for an arts council in the north of England, Northern Arts. And the Arts Council of Great Britain and its offshoots had been modeled somewhat on the WPA. And they encouraged me to do more research about it and possibly organize an exhibition in England of American art from the New Deal period. So I started looking into it, and I found that there was virtually no interest in it whatsoever in the United States. But there was one person who had just written a book about it, and that was Francis O'Connor, who was also coincidentally the premier scholar of Jackson Pollock's work. So I contacted him and I asked him if I could study with him. He was at the University of Maryland at the time. And he said he was leaving academe. He was not going to be teaching anymore. But there was one other person in the United States who was teaching it. And if I was willing to go to Cleveland, Ohio, and study with Carroll Ann Marling at Case Western Reserve, he would help me to do that. So Roy and I had a little discussion about it. He wanted to get out of the art administration business and get back to his own painting. So we decided to do that. And we did. And I had a wonderful experience with Dr. Marling. She had 2 PhDs and she was only 1 month older than I. So I was very impressed with her. And she is an amazing person. But she had just gotten a large NEH grant to do an exhibition called Federal Art in Cleveland, which was really a comprehensive survey. And Cleveland had a very big program. So she got her graduate students to do the research with her. So it was very hands-on. We found the works, we got them together, we put together an exhibition that was presented at the Cleveland Public Library. And no sooner was this whole thing coming together than she got a job at Vassar. So she asked me, one of her more mature students, well, how would you like to be the exhibition coordinator? Okay, I'm here and you're not. So I was. And we had over 400 objects in the show. And it was a real learning experience, not only the research part of it and the locating the works, but actually physically organizing a show and putting the works up on the wall. And I thought it was a great opportunity to move from, instead of going in a more academic direction, go in a museum and curatorial direction. So that
Mhm.
was really what got me started doing exhibitions and becoming a curator.
Mhm.
Real practical experience.
Yeah, and it almost seems like one step leads to the next, like it was meant to be, so to speak, right?
Well, people ask me sometimes to talk to their students about careers in the arts. And the thing that I always say, and I mean, I know it sounds a little trite, but when an opportunity presents itself, take it. Don't second guess yourself. Oh, what if it doesn't work out? Just try it and see if you like it. Great. If you don't, do something else. But
Hmm.
don't shut yourself off from potential. And I think that for me, of course, one advantage in a way that we have no children. So we didn't have to think about, oh, pulling the kids out of school, moving them from England to the United States, what's going to happen. That wasn't part of the equation.
Hmm.
So we had more freedom to be more flexible in that regard. And then, if I hadn't liked graduate school, I could always quit and do something else. But let's see how it goes. And for me, it went extremely well.
Hmm. And to fast forward, you recently wrote a series of art mystery novels, which are amazing. Um,
Thank you.
so how did you switch from, or while you're the museum director here, and then how do you get the inspiration to write these mystery novels, Helen?
Well, I didn't switch because the first four were done while I was still the director of the Pollock-Krasner house. So I did it in my spare time, if you like. But it was I am a mystery novel fan. I enjoy reading them. And there are times, I don't know how many you've read, but there are times when things just don't gel in the plot. In fact, I just read one recently where Georgia O'Keeffe is a mystery sleuth. She's, imaginary. And for me, the plot just did not work. And when I read that, I think, or, back when I first started thinking about this, I thought, I wonder if I could make up a plot that would gel, that would have the kind of logical progression of the first you have to kill somebody, and then you have to figure out who done it, and not to have coincidences, not to have red herrings that really don't pan out, to have things that made sense in the plot. So I tried it. It took me a while, actually. The first one, it took me a couple of years to pull it together because I had never written fiction before, and it's a very different process. But then once I had done it, the second one came rather more easily, and then it kind of just rolled on from there.
Right, that's what I meant by switch from like
Mhm.
writing about art history to writing fiction.
Well,
And
also, I mean, think about writing reviews. I did that for almost 30, well, I did it for over 30 years because the after I finished with the New York Times, when the Long Island section was killed in 2006, that was the end of that gig, 28 years. Well, that's long enough. But then I overlapped with the radio program, the Art Waves, which was on WLIU, which was the Long Island University station. And I did that for 5 years. And then I did the other column for 10 years for the Sag Harbor Express.
mhm.
So that kind of journalistic writing is subjective because they're paying me for my opinion. I mean, it's not an art history class. I'm not trying to just reel off a bunch of facts, but you do have to have your background knowledge. But it's basically a subjective opinion writing. And that is also very different from doing a catalog essay or an exhibition brochure or something where you want to give people insights into what the artist is trying to do rather than give your opinion about what you think about what the artist is doing. So that's a yet another kind of writing.
Mhm. Now, in your long career, uh, can you recall any obstacles that you faced that you had to overcome?
Well, I mentioned that I had a lot of encouragement from my family. So I always felt that if I set my mind to it, I could do it. But obviously, when you're as a practicing artist, the obstacles are getting recognition. And that was very, very hard. Also, working alone. Now here I am, starting to do more novels, which you do tend to be writing in your own space. But it made me very, I don't know, I just couldn't be alone with myself in the studio all day. I found that to be very discouraging. When you're in art school, you're with your friends, you have a lot of give and take, you're always, involved with other people's work as well as your own. And then when you go into the studio on your own, it's very isolated. At least it was for me. I'm a gregarious person. I like to be around other people, and I found it very dispiriting. So that was one reason that kind of helped me turn away from my own art practice without any regrets. But the one thing I do miss is, and you get this in writing too, that time just disappears. You're just into your own thing, you're working away, and pretty soon it's the next day and you didn't even realize it. And I find that fascinating. And that was something that as a practicing artist, I really enjoyed. But then being alone, not so much. But this is the kind of thing that you have to learn by doing. You can't know what it's going to be like. Roy, my husband, he's happy as a clam up there in the studio all day long by himself. That's where he likes to be, in his own head. But not me.
I relate with that, Helen. I had
Mhm.
the same experience, which is why I started working in museums. I didn't want to be alone all the time in a studio, so I never knew that about you. We share that in common.
I think that's not an uncommon thing. And then of course the discouragement of trying to get your work shown, trying to get your work seen and purchased, get a gallery. All those things are have nothing to do with the creativity in the studio. That's the business side of it. And I have to say, I always admired Elaine de Kooning because she was so disciplined about that. She had one day a week when that's all she did was the self-promotion side of it. Now, of course, she had one or two advantages that I, unknown me, did not have. But on the other hand, she understood what was involved, and Lee too. They knew how the art world worked and what you had to do to make yourself work within that system.
Mhm. Well, talk about Lee and Elaine. Women during that era of abstract expressionists faced sexism, sometimes overt, sometimes more subtle, like Hans Hofmann telling Lee that her painting was so good you would never know a woman did it.
Right.
And it was so, I didn't even know how to take that, right? That what a strange comment.
Mhm.
So, would you mind sharing with us, did you ever face sexism in the arts?
Not overtly, but I think that there is certainly in the museum hierarchy where the preponderance of major museum directors have usually in the past been male, although that is definitely changing. But I think that the certainly the gallery system, and I'm not telling anybody anything they don't know already, but the gallery system was very heavily weighted against women. Even the female dealers didn't necessarily want to represent female artists. And I remember visiting a studio once of an artist who had changed her first name, or she sort of like Lee, it was an androgynous name. And I was looking at her work for possibly including it in an exhibition. And she had sent her husband with the child out while I was there. And I only knew this because I bumped into them in the lobby coming up when I was going down. And
Mhm.
I thought, isn't that terrible that she would think that because she's married and has a child, that that would work against her work being included. But she was right.
Mm.
I mean, not for me, because I wouldn't have cared, but for some curators, for some museum directors, for some collectors, they didn't want that domesticity to be evident, because it could be detrimental. And I'm afraid, that hasn't changed all that much. And then, forgetting the racism side of it and the ageism side of it, there's so many obstacles to people just getting their work out to where it needs to be, that it can be very, very soul destroying.
Mm-hmm. So what advice would you give, let's say, a young woman starting out about how to deal with sexism or in general?
Develop a very thick skin. No, just you have to be persistent. You have to be driven. Like Lee, I mean, what was it that uh, Bill Lieberman said about her? That it was like taking holy vows, like a Carmelite nun. You had to be that committed. So if you're willing to do that, or if you have the grit to do that, then you have the better chance of succeeding, because you won't get ground down. But it can be hard for people who are more sensitive and who really don't have the stomach for that,
Mm-hmm.
male and female. Now, there are a lot of men who get pushed off to the wayside for whatever reason, and I'm not saying that it's purely a woman's problem, but the art world is small and it has a very strict hierarchy, and the good promoters tend to be, have a better career than those who are not good promoters.
Mm-hmm. I'll tell you what, I'd like to switch the conversation a little more specifically to the historic site in Pollock-Krasner.
Mhm.
So for the people who have never been here, I just want to give a little quick view of the studio, okay?
Oh,
And then
sure, go ahead.
yeah, I'm just going to point the camera this way so you can see, and we do, of course, hope you visit. This is the barn studio where Pollock worked, making his famous drip paintings on the floor. So there we have evidence of his masterpieces on the floor. We have historic photos of Lee and Pollock, and we also have the actual cans of paints that Pollock used, the house paint and his sticks and tools, his basters. And we also have evidence of Lee's paintings here because she was working in here following Pollock's death until her death in 1984. So we do hope you visit in person, and we also have virtual tours where we go in depth about the site. But
So
I'm
I'll
wondering,
tell you a little bit
yeah,
about my introduction to the studio, which was as the floor was being uncovered. In 1989, when the property was deeded to Stony Brook by Lee's estate in 1987, and they hired Meg Perlman to open the museum. And in her research, she saw photographs of the studio from before the floor was covered. So she realized that there was a wooden floor underneath the white tiles that you could see on the surface. So she very smartly went to the center of the room and pried up one of the tiles. And there was all this evidence underneath. So she called in the conservators and she contacted me, knowing that I was writing for the Times, and said, "We have this going on. Would you like to come and watch and see it and write it up for the paper?" So I said, "I'll be right over." And Roy grabbed his camera and the two of us got there. And the conservators were taking up each tile one at a time. And then there was a layer of tar paper underneath, and they were peeling that up. And I'm there taking notes, and Meg is giving me the background. And pretty soon we're all down on our hands and knees, peeling up the tar paper and revealing all of this amazing, the colors, the gestures, the evidence of Pollock's most famous board paintings. And it was really a wonderful experience. And so that was my introduction to the site. And then when Meg decided that she was going to move on and she wasn't going to take the job as a full-time job, she recommended that I consider applying for it, and I did. So that was in end of 1989. And the museum had only been open for a year. And then I started in March of 1990 as the first full-time director. She was part-time. And now, just as of the end of January, beginning of February, we have a brand new director, Matt Ward, who is wonderful. He's a Stony Brook PhD candidate and has some museum experience, some historic site experience, and is just doing a fabulous job of getting the place ready for the 2024 season.
And Helen, I want to show quickly, we do have a little picture of the unveiling of the floor here.
Yeah, there you see it.
There you go. And here
Yeah.
is when they're peeling back the paper. That must
Our
have
paper, right?
that
Uh-huh.
must have been so
Oh, it was
astounding.
wonderful because who knew? I mean, it was just under there waiting to be rediscovered. And then on the walls, you have Lee's marks. So there's a kind of an interplay. I mean, her energy, she was painting vertically, going against gravity, so that her marks, her energy is up on the walls. He, of course, is working horizontally. He's working with gravity. So the gestures are very different, but the energy is there for both of them. So especially in the virtual reality tour, you can get a sense of where their paintings were when they were working on them. They actually come back into the studio virtually and you feel like you're in that environment. So that has become a very useful interpretive tool that people can either experience at the museum or you can download it on your own equipment at home.
Mhm. And from your 34 years as director, what is your proudest accomplishment at the Pollock-Krasner House and Study Center?
That's an interesting question. Well, when we started out, we had no endowment. There was no funding that came with the property. Stony Brook accepted it on those terms, but agreed that it would be necessary to raise an endowment in order to perpetuate it. And it took quite a while to do that. But in 2012, we had the endowment drive and we were able to endow the general operations, the director's position, and a position in the art department at Stony Brook to study particularly 20th century American art. And I think that because it stabilized everything and it made it so much easier to operate without having to live from grant to grant or fundraising all the time. I think that's probably the most significant thing. And I did not do it alone. Believe me, we had a huge committee. We have a wonderful advisory committee who've been enormously supportive, and Stony Brook Foundation development people, or the advancement team. So it was a group effort, but it paid off. And that I think was very important. Also, getting a national landmark status, that happened right at the beginning. And that was good because it put us in the top group of historic sites nationwide. There are only about 3,000 altogether. And it helped to elevate our stature as a, not just a historic site, but as something worth supporting. So it enabled us to get grants that perhaps we wouldn't have been eligible for otherwise, including a Save America's Treasures grant, which got us the climate control and fire suppression systems. So that was very useful. And then starting the Historic Artist Homes and Studios program, we were founding members. We helped to develop and design the program through the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And there are now 55 sites nationwide. We started off with a dozen and we've got over 50. And that has been a very encouraging development because with the National Trust support, it also helps to elevate our profile nationally and even internationally.
Mhm. Now, Helen, you know, I have loved working with you over the past 20 years that I've been here because you have an encyclopedic knowledge of Pollock and Krasner, and I don't have to look in a book. I can just go into the office and ask Helen any question.
Well, and then you come in and ask me, and then I go and look in the book.
No, it's
But I
great.
know which book to look at. Ellen
Okay,
Landau's
no.
book, for one, which I'm so sorry is out of print now. I mean, it was in print for 30 years, and it is the go-to guide for a beautiful, beautifully illustrated and beautifully written it's a coffee table book, and it's the one that I go to if I want to, look up a reference.
Okay, so let's have some fun with this. What do you suppose are some of the unusual facts about Pollock and Krasner, their life or their work that people might not automatically know about, or the property itself?
Well, people, I mean, I've even heard docents say this at the Museum of Modern Art. People think that Jackson was dancing around to jazz music while he was painting. No, he was not. We have, oh, I don't know, maybe 250 photographs of the studio taken by Hans Namath from every conceivable angle. And not one of those pictures shows you a radio, a record player, a Victrola even. No, there was no music in the studio. But for some reason, people are fixated on this. And I have tried, whenever we give the tour, I always say, here's the record collection. We have all the records in the house. There they are. And here's the record player that he listened to, vintage 1954, but not in the studio. The music was in his head. And, it's just one of those things, one of my pet peeves, but that's something that people don't know that they should know.
Mm-hmm. Now, one time you shared with me that someone, a human being, is actually, their ashes are actually buried on the property.
That's true.
So this is something most people wouldn't know. Can you
Well,
tell us
almost
about
no
that?
one would know it because, for one thing, he's virtually unknown. But people do sometimes ask if the pile of rocks out behind the house is where their graves are. And of course, they're not. They're buried in Green River Cemetery, which is about a mile and a half from the house. And we give people a map who they can go over and visit that because there are many, many other artists and people from the art world who are buried over there. But the person who is buried under the rocks behind the house was an artist named Joseph Meert. He was a friend of Pollock's from the Art Students League. And the story goes that he saved Jackson's life. Apparently, Jackson would go to him and Margaret, his wife, when he was a little bit under the weather, shall we say, and didn't want to go home to Lee and get bawled out. This is in the city. He lived in Cooper Square. And Jackson would go over to his apartment and he would pick up a pebble. If you lived in New York City and you had friend who lived in a loft, you'd pick up a pebble from the street, you'd throw it up to the window, and then they would throw you down the key and you would go in. So he evidently staggered over from the Cedar Bar one night, and instead of throwing up the pebble, he fell down into a snowdrift and would have frozen to death if Joe hadn't realized he was out there and gone out, hauled him up, filled him full of coffee, and warmed him up. So when Joe died, he was basically destitute. And it's a long story. I won't go into the details, but Jeffrey Potter, one of Jackson's biographers, got his ashes. And he had them in the coal scuttle in his house. And then he was going to rent the house for the summer. And he said, could I leave Joe with you? And I said, sure, dead people don't bother me at all. It's the living ones I have a problem with. Anyway, he gives me Joe, and we kept Joe for a couple of years. And then we were doing some excavation work around the rocks, and we decided to plant Joe. So we had a little ceremony and we buried him. We had done an exhibition of his watercolors, and we put that in with the grave, and we put the catalog in with the ashes and covered him up. So Joe is there on the property in perpetuity.
Mhm. That's actually a really beautiful story, Helen.
And
Now,
especially with Jeffrey Potter was really responsible for kind of saving Joe's life toward the end when
yeah,
he needed medical care and stuff. So it was a nice way of bringing it full circle.
yeah. There was only one question I stumped you with, and you know what it was? Where the
Where are the pets buried?
yeah, the kids ask, the children ask me, where are the pets buried? That's the
I
only
have no idea. There were two
got on
dogs.
that.
Well, there was the crow, of course. There was the Caw, the crow. And we do have Caw's crow house for Mrs. Caw and Mr. Caw. But what happened to Jip and Ahab, the two dogs, I really don't know.
Okay. So on this note, I would like to open this conversation up to some of our attendees. Does anybody have any questions for Helen?
I see one.
Oh, okay. Yeah, good question. Grace Toy says, did Pollock and Krasner face anti-Semitism during their lives?
Well, Jackson was not Jewish, although I heard somebody, one of the docents at the Met, say that he was, but he was not. The family were nominally Presbyterian, but they were very anti-religious. And he was never baptized, although he was married in church. He was married, and he and Lee were married in the Marble Collegiate Church on Fifth Avenue. According to her story, when she decided that it was time they tied the knot, he said, I won't go to City Hall and just get a license like a dog. I have to be married in church. And then she had to find a church that would marry them, she being Jewish and he being nothing. And apparently the Dutch Reformed minister said, God won't care. And he married them. But also he was buried out of the Presbyterian chapel in Springs. I guess Lee said, well, he was married in church, so he's going to go out from church. But the anti-Semitism, I don't know that there was maybe Ellen would know more about this than I, whether or not she ever experienced it directly. I mean, there was the anti-woman bias probably was more um, more influential for her than any anti-Jewish bias, because there would have been lots of other Jewish artists in New York. But whether or not she ever experienced anti-Semitism as just even as a person rather than in the art world, I honestly don't know.
And her family left Russia and moved to Brooklyn because of anti-Semitism, right?
Oh, it wasn't just anti-Semitism; they were killing them. There were pogroms, and they had to get out. And then, well, Joseph, the father, came first, and then he sent for the rest of the family.
Mm. And Lisa Traeger has a question about the psychoanalytic drawings. Lisa, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, hi Joyce, hi Helen. It's so
Hi,
great to
Lisa.
see you, and I'm thoroughly enjoying this hour. I really appreciate it. I recently read the book Jackson Pollock's Psychoanalytic Drawings. I found it fascinating. I would like your take on something that Weishaupt says. He writes, if the aim of Pollock's drip method was not to reach into areas of unconscious experiences, but to veil those unconscious experiences which had already been tapped in the preliminary process of eliciting automatic imagery, then the second stage of his painting, the one he reveals to us, the drip painting, is not the automatic stage, but rather the academic stage.
Well, that doesn't make an awful lot of sense to me, but I don't know. I mean, I think that there's this famous encounter between Jackson and Lee where she says that he said he chooses to veil the imagery. So
Right.
there's no question that the imagery is there in his head, but he's expressing it in a different form so that it's not so literal. And then, of course, in 1951, he's still using the pouring method, but he then went back to recognizable imagery, even if it's very abstract. There's a kind of dichotomy between abstraction, where you're abstracting from something, you're starting with something, and then you're taking it in another direction, and pure non-objectivity, where it doesn't relate to anything in the outside world, where it's pure invention. And in Pollock's case, there would have been some kind of figurative I guess, a concept in his mind where even the most quote unquote abstract work still has suggestions of shapes and forms that you could recognize from the literal world. Even, many of the poured paintings, you can see outlines of figures or faces. And I don't think that that's wrong. I don't think that that's a bad interpretation. It just depends on how you see it. But to imagine that his poured paintings are academic, I don't know, in some way that just doesn't strike me as making an awful lot of sense.
Because he was going through all this Jungian therapy. So he was putting down in the first layer the things that were, his true subconscious. And then they were too revealing and too personal and too open. So then the next layer was to kind of obscure it. That's the theory.
Well,
I don't know.
that's a theory. Okay. No, I think that whatever came out was very spontaneous, but the drawings, of course, he did not do them in therapy. He did them and took them to the therapist for
Yeah.
interpretation.
Yeah.
But that was several years before he started really doing all over board painting.
Okay.
Although, you know, had already worked with Siqueiros, David Alvaro Siqueiros in the workshop in New York, where your father, Harold Lehman, excuse me, was
Mhm.
also involved. And that kind of spontaneity that was encouraged there was more of a technical nature, but that obviously gave him the tools that he needed to create the kind of imagery that really expressed what he needed to express.
Thank you.
Okay, I have a question, Helen. I love this one.
Uh-oh.
This
I
is a
better be
hard,
ready for this.
this is a hard one. You ready?
Mm.
Okay. How would you answer the question, what is art?
What is art? Well, what is art to me and what is art to other people may be two different things. If you want to think back to Pollock's statement to Lee when he was in a quandary, and again, I talked about how they would go into each other's studios, and evidently at one point he asked her to come in and take a look at what he was doing, and he said, "Is this a painting? Not is it a good painting, or do you like it, but is it a painting at all?" So I think for the artist, it's whatever you feel is solving whatever creative problem you're having. That's the process of trying to come to a solution to express what you need to express, whether it's in a very figurative mode or a very abstract mode or a non-objective mode. Getting there is the creative process. But the product, that's another matter. Once you've done it, somebody has to look at it and relate to it. So that's where the question comes in. It's not the artist's question. The artist knows. But then the viewer, the audience has to interpret it.
And I see Grace says, how did Pollock define what a painting was?
Well, like I said, he didn't really define it so much as to encourage you to define it for yourself. Now, he did talk about trying to make a statement with his work. The idea that the art had to speak to you in some way. And I think that is very challenging for a lot of people. But again, if you take his advice and look at it passively, then you get what you can from it. If you don't like it, then you look at something different. But as long as you're willing to open yourself up to look at it in your own way, then you can appreciate whatever it gives you.
And Ellen Landau says, what are your thoughts about all the attention now being given to Janet Sobel and the implication that Pollock stole the all-over style from her?
Well, there's a word that I would not use in polite company, so I'll use a euphemism, which is balderdash. It's complete nonsense. And don't take my word for it. Not only Siqueiros, 1936, which is 10 years before anyone ever saw anything by Janet Sobel, but you look at Pollock's work from 1942, 1943, long before he saw work by Janet Sobel, and you will see poured painting. I mean, they're in the catalog raisonné. It's not like you can't find them. Or it's not like somebody said, oh, well, I remember seeing those, but now they're not around anymore. They are around, and they predate any experience he had with Janet Sobel. I rest my case. End of discussion.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and Donald.
And can I unmute myself?
You
Say
can.
something? Yeah.
Ellen Landau.
Yeah, hi. Part of it, of course, has to do with the increased interest in women abstract expressionists. There's no
Yeah.
question about that. It's in my opinion, it's Clement Greenberg that made this happen
Yeah.
when he said that he and Pollock saw her works and they were furtively interested in them. And
Well,
that,
yeah, but you can be furtively interested without running back to the studio and duplicating them. I mean, give me a break.
1000%. It drives me crazy because people are asking me all the time, well, Pollock didn't start this, and of course, all of the even the things that we were talking about, we were talking about a bit ago of first layers being figurative and this and that and whatever it is. I mean, it's not even what Janet Sobel did. It doesn't even remotely resemble that. But she made a big hoo-ha in the show in Europe. That and all these European writers, etc., were writing, oh my God, this is a big discovery. Jackson Pollock didn't start the drip and board style, etc. So
Well, we
anyway,
know he didn't start the drip style. I mean, other
yeah,
people
of
had done it
course.
before him. So it's nothing to do with the material.
And what he did with it is so entirely different from anything that
Exactly.
Janet Sobel did that it's kind of ridiculous. But I was wondering if anybody asked you about that. Do people bring
Oh
that up,
yeah,
or is that
not a lot, but well, the
Yeah.
one that I get more often was Jackson an agent of the CIA? You know, the
Yeah, of
whole
course.
nonsense about the Cold War stuff, which again, I would not use the term in polite company, but it's just ridiculous. But then, remember the old installation at the Museum of Modern Art where they had the Room of Pollock. There was
Mhm.
one wall where they had the Janet Sobel, and they
Mhm.
had work by a guy named Newt Merrill. And that was poured painting. And I think wasn't he on the West Coast, if I'm
Yes,
yeah, okay.
California. Mhm.
So there were, and then I think there was maybe a Max Ernst that had one of those with the can thing that just to show that there were other people doing this, that the technique was not unique to Pollock, nor was he the first person ever to do it. And that was fine, but that kind of interpretation is gone now. And now it's just, he stole it from a Ukrainian housewife, and it's just ridiculous. And what about Hoffman? Yeah, and Lisa says yes, but it's true that the thing about Hoffman is his work wasn't seen in New York until what, 1946, 47, 46, I guess it was, when Robert Coates wrote the review in the New Yorker, where he used the term abstract expressionist applied to art in the United States for the first time, and ironically used it in conjunction with Hoffman, who knew it from Germany back in 1915. So there was an interesting conjunction there, but it's kind of a very, that's also a little known fact that abstract expressionism actually arose in Europe right after the First World War, long before Americans adopted that term.
It also has to do with the dating of that one particular painting by Hoffman called Spring.
1940, right.
Yeah, which the dating is probably incorrect. Yeah.
Yeah. But we know the dating of Pollock's works because they were shown at the time in 1943.
Right.
Okay, we have one more question, Helen. Donald Sousis says, please share your recollects about writing and producing Hampton's Bohemia. And he has a photo of you at Canio signing books.
My past catching up with me. That book is almost 20 years old now. It's interesting because I had I'm sorry, it's over 20 years old. It came out in 2002. But I was invited when the town of East Hampton had its 350th anniversary. I was invited to give a talk about the artists of the Hamptons, and I had someone I didn't know at the time had also been invited to give a talk about the literary community. And we were approached to put these two things together and make a single book about the artists and writers of the Hamptons. And it was published by Chronicle Books in 2002. And it's long out of print now, but putting it together, the process involved kind of seamlessly weaving together the writers and the artists. And that was done by a very good editor who made it flow in a very seamless way. And then another thing that I liked about the way it was packaged, the imagery and the text related to each other. So if you were talking about an artwork or talking about a poem, it would be there on that page or the next page. So it wasn't like an art book with signatures where you have to flip through to see what is being written about. And I think that that kind of, that format was very engaging. So I'm very proud of that book. And unfortunately, my co-author, Constance Denny, just recently died, but she was a wonderful person to work with, very, very erudite. She knew all about the writers of the area. And so it worked out extremely well.
Helen, I want to thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. And just, I want to thank you for the 20 years that we worked together at the Pollock-Krasner House and Study Center. It really was always a pleasure.
It
Just-
went by in a flash, I have to say.
I know, it all goes by 34 years, 24 years, because it's just been fun. It's been just a pleasure, and appreciate.
Well, let me
much.
just say before we close, I have to hand it to you, Joyce, because not only did you develop this program and really make it work, but you pivoted so brilliantly during the COVID pandemic and working on Zoom with, I mean, we now last year had over 240 Zoom programs and live ones as well, because you were coming back on site with your family art workshops. So it's just, this program has grown enormously and it has reached out to so many more people than we could even reach in person. So that's all thanks to you. So give a Zoom hand for Joyce.
No, give a Zoom hand to Helen. No, seriously. And Helen, we look forward to seeing your future projects. We know you're going to continue to create.
I've
And-
got another book coming out next January.
And the books are amazing. Where can people find those novels?
Well, they're on Barnes and Noble has the not only the mysteries, but other books as well. Also things that are out of print, like Hampton's Bohemia, you can get on Abe Books or eBay sometimes. But if you go to my website, that's helenharrison.net, you'll see them all listed.
Excellent. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today and for your
Thank you. Thank you so
wonderful
much, everybody.
Have a good evening or day wherever you are. Bye.
Bye-bye.